Languedoc sat in his office, rubbing his temples methodically. His eyes closed as he dutifully retraced the course of events that had shaped his life and brought him to this very moment. He often found this to be an extraordinary technique for untangling himself from what at first appeared to be intractable predicaments, as memory was the Gordian knot which often tangled itself in the seam of reality, like fool's gold in a rich vein, and if one could simply identify where one's perspective had first begun to deviate from the facts, then one was likely to be able to conceive of a solution. France was largely in ruins after the war, as it had been after nearly every war since 1871, and the south of that country had reaped the bitter tang of both wine and death that season. These memories came only in flashes, as he had been only a young boy, but he could clearly remember the look of sheer panic that had entered his mother's eyes when the American soldiers had stopped their car at the checkpoint. He would not see that expression again until the horse that he was leading through the barn of the boarding school he had attended in upstate New York had spooked and reared up on its hind legs, its eyes bulging lifeless with terror. But his father had simply rolled down his window and spoken in the soft, clipped speech of a man who was not to be trifled with, and the soldiers had let them pass. From there they had boarded a small single-engine aircraft that had been waiting for them in a long clearing not far from the road, and after a bumpy takeoff, they had begun the long, uncomfortable journey that would take them to first Switzerland and then to New York City. Years later, after his father had passed and he was given access to the secret files hidden in certain Swiss lock boxes, he would come to learn that his father had been instrumental in assisting the German occupiers at the behest of the Vichy government with identifying and itemizing for the purposes of seizure the assets of French Jewish citizens. And it seemed as though he had been paid well for it. For they had lived quiet, comfortable lives on New York's Upper East Side, cheek and jowl with neighbors with names like Rosenbaum and Greenwald. Languedoc had been, of course, horrified initially by this, but after some months he had decided that what remained of his family's ill-gotten wealth was not nearly enough to redress the horrors which had been inflicted upon the children of Israel, and after contributing a large chunk of it to the foundation of remembrance, the topic remained mostly absent from his mind. And although the cliché has been iterated nearly to the point of insolvency by popular culture, the 60s and 70s had been a hazy period of American life, as well as his own, as the contact high induced by the fog of war had engulfed the country in a strange fugue. Languedoc had been largely rootless during this time, and after graduating Princeton, he had been completely alone. His mother and father were dead, and he had no relations. He had at first considered striking out to California, but eventually he had been drawn towards Washington, D.C., through the magnetic pull of his chain of acquaintance, where he had quietly blossomed on the strength of his inoffensive competency. He had met Joe shortly after his first election to the Senate. The future president had been only a few years younger than himself and brimming with the confidence of one who has unwittingly stumbled into the halls of power. Languedoc had seen the potential immediately, as Joe had emerged from a small mid-Atlantic state after upsetting the gears of what had once been a well-oiled political machine. And after attaching himself to the senator's team, he had immediately set about rebuilding it, so as to almost guarantee Joe perpetual re-election, which had then allowed Languedoc for 35 years to stalk the Senate like a panther, leaving his indelible mark upon the body like a brand upon a bull. Languedoc had always encouraged Joe's political ambition, like a parent patronizes a child's assertion of future greatness, though Languedoc had no desire for notoriety. But repeated and futile presidential campaigns had only served to solidify Joe as a Khrushchev-esque fool amongst the political class. Affable and harmless, like a laboratory retriever who shakes his tail so vigorously with joy that one can not help but feel simultaneously flattered and contemptuous. But so how much had changed over the years, and perhaps because he had scrutinized these political motions in millimeters, much like a geologist tracks the movements of glaciers, Languedoc had failed to grasp the implication of such trajectories. The beret-wearing communists of the 60s and 70s had traded their hemp sweaters and rose-colored spectacles for suits and ties, and soon the Basseurs de Couchons, over whom his father had softly and violently seethed that in French as he read his morning paper, had wormed their way into the very center of American institutions, like parasites digging into the heart's well-muscled flesh. The world was different now, and Languedoc had been slowly preparing his final exit, for he and Joe were now strangers in a strange land, refugees of time rather than space. And so, when they had come to him, the agent provocateurs of political chaos, and flattered him, he had accepted against his better judgment their offer of a brief and glorious capstone to his career, wherein he might serve as a conduit for the greater things to come. But despite his reservations, Languedoc was unperturbed by his participation in the scheme, as he was well aware after riding the political animal for more than 4 decades that the figures who emerged from the haze of the American zeitgeist were merely the ghosts in the machine, whose rise and fall were ultimately ruled by the mercurial trident of Poseidon. And besides, he had already plotted his escape, for he had planned to reverse the journey his father had made decades before from New York. From New York, he would fly to Zurich and retrieve the fruits of his own modest political misdeeds, and from there he would return to the country of his youth and abide with whatever storms might overlap with his swiftly diminishing years. America was a very young country, and there was no reason to expect that it would remain, but France was, and had always been France, perpetual and eternal.